Welcome to The Pursuit, a podcast produced by the Junior Board of the Chicago Midwest Chapter of the National Academy of Television Arts and Sciences, otherwise known as NATAS. We're a group of emerging media professionals seeking insight from leaders in our fields. I'm Anthony Landahl. I'm a video producer with NBC News, and I'm also your host for this episode. Our guest today is many things, I must say: a writer, producer, author, and the president of the NATAS Chicago Midwest Chapter, none other than John Owens. John had a long career at the Chicago Tribune, where he was one of the early video producers with a newspaper outlet, a pioneer in a sense, and has worked with Weigel Broadcasting in Chicago and WLS-ABC-7 in the programming department. We had a great talk about what it means to change with the times and technology in the industry, getting a book published, and what it's like being the president of the local NATAS chapter. So without further ado, I give you John Owens. The first question, obviously, we always like to start off this podcast with, as you know, when was the moment you knew you wanted to pursue the career you had now?
Well, I've had sort of two careers. One as a writer, concentrating on nonfiction writing, journalism, and then the other career is sort of a visual storyteller / journalist. And I would say, I early on, when I was a grade school student, I loved movies and would stay up late. This is in the pre-cable, pre-streaming days when you had three networks and you had here in Chicago you had WGN and WFLD. I'd stay up late to watch the late movie on ABC-7. They used to show the old RKO movies after midnight, and the idea of telling stories visually always really thrilled me. And then conversely, writing, was always a passion of mine, going back to high school on the school newspaper and working for the college newspaper in Boston. That was always a passion of mine, and luckily I got to sort of combine both passions, most notably when I worked at the Chicago Tribune. So, but a short answer to your question, Anthony, is early on from my grade school days, I was always interested in telling stories either visually or through writing.
You've worn a lot of hats in your career, and as in the introduction, I'll list out writer, reporter, researcher, co-author, multimedia reporter. You've worked in radio, television. It all kind of centers around, like you said, nonfiction. Why not fiction? Why did you edge towards the nonfiction genre?
That's a good question. That was always a dream of mine. Going to Southern California and somehow getting involved with movies, but the opportunities just weren't there. And I think that I was distracted by journalism, specifically in college, because I worked on a great college newspaper called the Daily Free Press in Boston, at Boston University. So when I came back to Chicago, that was the one real marketable skill that I had, was as a journalist. I made a few fictional student films, but I didn't have the resources to pack up and move to LA, and I didn't have the real connections, but I did have here in Chicago a few connections that led me to the Tribune, which is where I would spend the majority of my early career, my career up until age 50. So I still fiddle around with fiction, and I did get a chance to work doing scripted fiction material, although in a sort of a lighthearted way. I did some sketch comedy for Weigel Broadcasting on a show called Tune In With Me, which is still on. So I really, it told me that I still enjoy working with actors. So you never know; it's not too late. Maybe I can go back to that at some point.
And like you've said, you had that long tenure at the Tribune. What were some of your early memories there about starting out? And you started out as like an editorial assistant, correct?
That's correct. That started in 1987. It was a year out of school. I had worked in a number of odd jobs before the Tribune. and started as an editorial assistant in their sports department covering high school sports. And it was a different era. The obviously online wasn't around at that time, so we were solely working towards producing something for print, which was interesting and challenging, dealing with deadlines for the first time. But I met so many great characters, especially in the sports department, people who were no longer with us, who had covered sports going back to the 40s and 50s and 60s, guys like Ed Stone, who was a longtime beat writer for the Blackhawks, and a guy named Dan Moulton, who was a beat writer for the Bears back in the 50s and 60s. It was a different era for journalism still, but it was starting to change when I first started working at the Tribune in 1987. I should add that, while I was doing that, it was sort of a part-time gig, so I still had a foot in film. I was a projectionist, I screening movies for at a place called Cinecenter. I would screen movies for critics and rushes for filmmakers who were shooting in town. So I screened rushes for people like John Hughes on movies like Uncle Buck, and I screened rushes for Ferris Bueller. So I've always sort of had a sort of a foot in both worlds, and that's something that I've carried on throughout my career, sort of having a foot in both worlds in journalism and in visual mediums like television.
Well, yeah, and I find it interesting that eventually you worked your way up to being a video producer with the Tribune. And that's interesting because it was kind of moving into more the digital age. I feel like that was like around the time you started getting to that was like an early time for that role, if I'm not mistaken, correct?
It definitely was. This was the mid 90s. There was a brilliant man named Owen Youngman who definitely saw the future with news organizations, and he was sort of the leading innovator in creating a online group, a web team, which started out as a digital Tribune and sort of morphed into ChicagoTribune.com. And he was also instrumental in creating an early 24-hour news channel for the Tribune, a place called CLTV, which was around for probably about 25 years, started back in 92 or 93 and lasted up until around 2017, 2018. So I had worked at, I started working in television by I worked at a place called City News Bureau, which is a legendary news organization, a newswire organization that served Chicago and served both the newspapers and television stations. The newswire agency with the motto, "If your mother says you love her, check it out." It was like a thorough news gathering organization that had been around for 100 years. But I worked there, worked at Fox. That was my first TV station, and then moved to CLTV, which was Tribune owned, the second local 24-hour news channel in the U.S. behind New York One, and worked there for a few years, and then moved to the Downtown Tribune to help launch their video department. And then at that time, video and newspapers, it was just a complete oddity. Even places like the New York Times, they had, they were starting to deal with video, but they didn't have their own department. They were partnering with other organizations like Discover and other TV producers. So the Tribune was probably the first newspaper in the country to have a video department. And what they did and what we did is sort of repurpose content that was originally produced for the newspaper and turn it into television content. And then eventually, as the web started to be able to present video in a way where it wasn't buffering every 10 seconds, we would start to produce material for the web as well. And this was, as I said, very early on, 96, 97, 98.
I was going to ask, what were some of the early challenges dealing with just digital journalism that you remember? You mentioned the buffering times, and 10 seconds seems like an anomaly now. But
Right.
what else do you remember about just being like, I wish they could solve this problem that eventually did get solved, but you didn't know back then?
Well, that was the main thing. I mean, the main video platform at that time, and some of the older listeners and viewers will remember this is a Real Video. And you had to really crunch down the video. You couldn't export it at its native in its native settings. It had to be, a really small file. So it didn't look good at all when it was presented online. And then for the viewer, it was a challenging experience because of the video would stall and buffer. The buffering was a consistent problem. So in the early days, it just wasn't feasible to do a lot of video online, and the video that you did produce had to be short, and it had to be the resolution was low. But that changed by the early 2000s, and by 2004, 2005, 2006, at the Tribune, we were doing sophisticated documentaries, multi-part documentaries, both for online and for television. So things changed. I remember one great project that I worked on called the documentary is called Oil Safari, and the print component was called A Tank of Gas, A World of Trouble. We worked on it with a brilliant journalist named Paul Salopek, who works for National Geographic now, and it was a 80-minute documentary that looked at one gas station in the Chicago area and traced where all the oil came from, that would go into this one gas station. So it was traveling across the globe to tell the stories of the people who extracted this oil, and some of the major issues that were caused by oil production in these countries, like Nigeria and Venezuela and Iraq, and then just bring those stories together in this online documentary. There was also a companion PBS documentary. So, and by that time, this was 2006. Video production, you could watch videos online. We presented it through Flash, which is something that no longer exists.
No longer exists, which is crazy to think about. Even I remember Flash.
Right.
It's odd to think that that's been gone for, I don't know, a couple of years now, right? It seems like it's been gone longer.
It's probably at least a couple of years, but that's the thing. The platforms, everything changes every couple of years now. This started in, say, the mid O's, 2005, 2006, and from then on, every 2-3 years, there's a big, a groundswell, a shift in what's happening with video production, specifically for online and for broadcast and for streaming.
It seemed like for a long time there, I mean, I'm assuming through the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, the technology was getting better and better, but it wasn't jumping at the rate, like you said, from the mid 2000s up to the point we're at. It seemed like there was like a very increasing rate. Would you agree?
Oh, I definitely agree. It was, from say 2005, 2006, 2007, 2008, you saw so many things develop within that period. Like YouTube was launched in, around that 2006, 2007 time. The iPhone came about at about the same time. These past 15 years have just seen so many incredible changes with regards to media.
Looking at your career and just an outline of what you've done, it seems like you had an early blueprint for what would be considered the multimedia journalist. And I think you do consider yourself a multimedia producer, right?
Absolutely.
It seems like you kind of grew with the times.
Yeah, well, that's exactly right, Anthony. I mean, they didn't have multimedia journalists when I started in the 80s and early 90s. You were pigeonholed, and you concentrated on one specific thing, and you had, at the TV stations, you had, and you still have, unions that sort of helped helped along that sort of, rigid, as great as unions are, and I definitely support all unions, but they sort of encouraged, concentrating on one specific thing at, if you had multiple skills, you couldn't really use them back in the 80s and 90s. So yeah, I think, one thing about me and working at the Tribune, and again, I'm a supporter of unions, but with the Tribune now they have a union, but back then they didn't, and maybe that was a disadvantage in terms of collective bargaining and making more money than I made at the time. But conversely, I got to do a lot more things. I got to edit and shoot video and do things that I couldn't do at a television station by working at the Tribune back in the mid 90s. So I think that sort of encouraged my ability to be sort of a pioneering multimedia journalist where I worked at the time, the Tribune.
Now you're working as a programming producer with WLS. That's did you ever imagine yourself in this type of role, and how do you enjoy working kind of back in the TV news section?
I worked at the Tribune for a long time, for 25 years, but when I worked at the Tribune, I was constantly working with the broadcast news stations that the Tribune owned, and they owned 25 or 26, including both WGN and CLTV. So I was always involved in broadcast production as well. So working at ABC is not strange at all. Also, I worked at Weigel Broadcasting for quite some time as well after the Tribune. So I know I've always been involved with broadcast, so it's not strange at all to work at ABC.
The difference between TV broadcast and working with video there and working with video in the newspaper business, you alluded to a little bit before. Did you prefer one versus the other? Is there a way to TV news that you enjoy more than newspaper?
Working for a newspaper and the disciplines are different, and the way you present a story is different. So with print, you can obviously provide more detail. As a print reporter, you can the camera is great, but a lot of times it hurts. It can hurt you in terms of getting. If you're doing an interview, people tend to be a little more relaxed if a camera's not around. So you run the risk of not necessarily staging things, but the reality is different when a camera's there. So with print, there's a lot more flexibility involved. That said, there's nothing better than visual storytelling to present the documentation of a news story. So there are definite differences, but now things have changed a lot. In this city, the print organizations like the Tribune and the Sun-Times, they've had to downsize due to the changes with advertising. I would say now you have broadcast organizations like WBEZ, and they probably do as well as the Tribune and the Sun-Times with presenting news in a variety of mediums. They have great writers at WBEZ. They do a great job with interactive media. So the lines have sort of blurred between how broadcasters present news and how print organizations present news.
From your perspective, and especially with your experience, do you feel like video is still the king of all the mediums, or do you feel like print, and not even print, but just kind of the written word, still has this stronghold over how people consume media or entertainment? or their news for that matter?
Well, that's a good question. I feel that they complement each other better now than ever before. I think that you look at the New York Times and the way that they present stories now. It's not just print; it's a combination of everything. You have great the video and stills and animation, presenting graphics through animation that helps you to tell a complete story. So I think that now, I don't think there's that videos on top or prints on top. I think that now, especially with the way that the news organizations present their information, their content online, that they complement each other. So I think again, the lines are blurred. To tell a story now, you need more than just words. You need more than just pictures.
Is there a medium of those two that you love to work with or you prefer to work with?
Depends on the day. you know, I enjoy writing because it's just you and the keyboard, and it's you tell a story just through words and through being creative with your writing. So I mean, I enjoy that, but I also enjoy working as a documentarian and telling a story visually and telling a story where you hear natural sound and you hear the interview subjects. So it depends on the day. Some days I prefer writing, other days I prefer producing visual videos and documentaries.
I think a lot of students today always feel like when they go to college or they have to pick a skill and ride with it for a long time. Do you think that some people are made to pick a skill and be really good at that thing, or do you think some of us are made to do a little bit of everything? Or do you think that those are two different kinds of people?
Some people are better at multitasking than others, I would say. When you're doing too many things, you risk being deficient in one area or another. So maybe there's some truth in the jack of all trades, master of none. Um, Sometimes I wonder, maybe I should be just concentrating on one specific thing and I could improve on, say, my writing if that's all I did every day, or I could improve on my skills as a producer and director and videographer if I just concentrated on that. Sometimes I wonder about that. But at the end of the day, it really depends on the person. Some people are better at multitasking than others, and some people are meant to just concentrate on one specific area of media and communications.
You're listening to The Pursuit, the podcast produced by the Junior Board of the National Academy of Television Arts and Sciences Chicago Midwest Chapter. I'm John Owens, the NATAS Chicago Midwest Chapter President. And please consider donating to the charitable arm of NATAS, the NATAS Chicago Foundation. We provide thousands of dollars in scholarships to high school and college students who are majoring in communications-related programs. Of course, your donations are tax deductible, so it will be especially impactful if you can contribute before the end of the year. Also, and this is for students, deadlines to apply for scholarships are early next year. Deadlines for college and graduate scholarships are in February, and deadlines to apply for high school scholarships are in March 2023. Go to chicagomeonline.org to make a donation. And now, back to The Pursuit.
And speaking of your writing, you have a book out now that came out that you co-authored, the Chili Dog MVP, correct?
That's right. That came out last year. I'm the co-author with David Fletcher is my co-author on the book. It's a sports book, but it has the supporting stories about Chicago during an age of change in the early 70s. So it's about the White Sox, the Chicago White Sox, the American League team in town, and their meteoric slugger who they acquired in 1972, a guy named Dick Allen, who baseball fans will know fairly well. He's a guy who pretty much save the team from leaving Chicago through his brilliance as an athlete. So it looks at him, looks at the organization, looks at some of the problems that they had that led to them nearly moving back in the late 60s to Milwaukee. And it looks at some of the major players on the team, but it also looks at the city at that time, which was still under Mayor Richard J. Daley, who was then in his 17th year as mayor of the city. And it looks at some serious issues about Chicago, including segregation and changing specific neighborhoods. During that time, the racial change in certain neighborhoods and issues that occurred due to change of races in certain neighborhoods. So it covers politics as well, city politics. So it's a book that it's over 400 pages, and it's a very interesting read. Not targeted specifically at sports fans, although the story, the center of the story is a well-known athlete, baseball player who should be in the Hall of Fame, but isn't in the Hall of Fame yet.
Can you talk about the process, the early process when you first had the idea to write this book? Was there any other option you looked at besides a book? Did you look at doing a podcast about this? Did you do it like thinking about doing this in some type of video form? Why did you have a book specifically?
Yeah, that's a great question, Anthony. Actually, the book was optioned by some guys from ESPN, and they've had some issues with it, not only fundraising, but I mean, it's a hard story to tell visually. You can do it, but it's hard to tell visually because there's just not a lot of video, believe it or not, of the White Sox in the early 70s. And this is because back then the TV stations they didn't archive anything. If they taped a full baseball game, they probably taped it with the idea of submitting it for some sort of award. Tapes were hard to come by back then, so TV stations routinely to archive shows, they would tape over, dub over the original media on the tape like 5, 6, 7, 8 times. So as a result, nothing was saved. So it would be a difficult story to tell as a documentary. It would be somewhat easier as a podcast. We never really thought about doing it as a podcast. We always thought of it as a book, just because you can provide a lot more detail with a book. And that's why we went the print route. We had a complicated story to tell. It wasn't just about sports, but it was also about the city. And again, you could definitely do it as a podcast. It'll be a lot more challenging to do it as a documentary. But the book was probably the easiest way to tell the story within the time period that we had. We wanted to try to get it out by late 2021, which is basically what we did, because part of the reason for writing this book was Dick Allen is a much admired player with regards to other players, but he wasn't really well admired by the media. So we were trying to make a case for Dick and how he deserved to be in the Hall of Fame. So this book was sort of written. It was written for obviously the public, but it was also written for the people who vote on baseball players who deserve to be in the Hall of Fame. And we felt that Dick really deserved to be in the Hall of Fame.
Focusing on writing a book, and that I'm assuming takes a good amount of energy and focus. And like you said, it's kind of just writing and researching, but you're mostly pen to paper. Describe that process. And I didn't know if this was your first book or not, but just take us through the process of writing the book and maybe some of the challenges you encountered as a content creator and someone who works in this industry.
Yeah, well, it was challenging because that was not the only thing I was doing. We were kind of fortunate in a way that wrote it during the pandemic. Fortunate in that everybody was home, so it was the survivors on the team, and fans and media who we feature in the book. They were available for interviews on Zoom and on the phone. We didn't really have to travel to anybody. So that made things a little easier. While I was writing the book, I was, working full time. And, as I mentioned earlier, I was working at Weigel Broadcasting at the time. I was working on a new show, which I also mentioned earlier, which was an entertainment show. And we were in the process of creating that too. And I was writing on that. So, we were writing for a daily scripted show, which was, was a real challenge, writing for characters and writing also to provide information about the vintage cartoons that we were, featuring in that show. So I was doing that while I was writing, and I took a break, maybe a 2-week vacation or 3-week vacation, use vacation time to concentrate solely on the book and, do research on the book. And that took time. My writing partner has he in addition to being a writer, and he's a doctor full time, but he also created a not-for-profit entity called the Chicago Baseball Museum. So he was able to collect all these artifacts, most notably a lot of notes and material from a great baseball writer who worked for the Tribune and the Sun-Times, a guy named Jerome Holtzman. So we had all these old sporting news and Sports Illustrated magazines that were used for research, in addition to material online from newspapers like the Daily News and the Tribune. But that all took time. That all took a lot of time. So it's just a matter of managing and regimenting my time throughout the 10, 11 months that it took to first do the interviews and research, and then finally sit down and write. We had a goal of, doing chapters that were roughly around 5,000 to 10,000 words. So it's and that's about 20, 30 pages per chapter, a little more than that. So it all took a lot of time. It was just a matter of, managing the time and balancing, doing that and doing, my day job. So it was definitely a challenge. It was an interesting challenge. We're writing a sequel now, so and just getting started with the sequel, which will cover the city and the White Sox organization through the construction of the new Comiskey Park, which is now 30 years old, and some of the drama that was behind the construction of that controversial new facility. So again, within the next year, so I'm going to have to balance my time, writing this project and doing my day job, and also, continuing my work with NATAS.
I was going to ask, what's the ratio of research to actual writing? How would you break it down in percentages?
I'd say half and half. I mean, you can't, if you don't have all your information lined up and all the content that's necessary to write, then you're not going to be able to write anything. So yeah, you have to have the background information first, along with the interviews, before you can really sit down and craft a entertaining, readable story. So it's about half and half.
What lessons are you going to take from the first book that you learned about maybe the writing process and even the story of the White Sox itself, and take that into the next book? What lessons have you learned?
Well, we as I mentioned, we kind of had a real hard deadline to get it done by late 2021 for the Hall of Fame vote. And, I think we rushed through some things. Now we have sort of an open-ended deadline. We want to definitely have it out by 2020, early 2024. But, I think the lesson learned is to, if you want to be a good, thorough writer, you have to take your time and write. You can't push things. You have to have deadlines, but you can't, rush through things. And I think that we kind of, although we've gotten nothing but great feedback from the first book. I there are things that I would have done a little differently in terms of writing. So it's hopefully with this next book, we won't be rushing through the process like we did that for the first book.
You're the president of the Chicago Midwest chapter of NATAS. And I guess let's just start off. How did you get involved with the organization? And what were you doing before you were the president?
So I started with NATAS as a member of the Board of Governors back in 2009. I believe it was one of my former bosses, Jim Dish, who suggested me. Jim Dish was the news director at CLTV back in the 90s when I was there, and he had remembered me and offered up my name to nominated me for the board. So I was nominated in 2009 and worked in different capacities with the board. I produced the Emmys for 4 years in the mid-teens. So I produced some fun shows with Richard Roper was a host one year, and then we had a controversial one that I produced with Jerry Springer. And no one, a lot of people in the media didn't want him back in town, but he was just a prince of a man, a great guy who was a great host and was very very available. It was always available as a host, and was very engaging with the audience, and shook hands. I like to tell the story because Springer doesn't have the greatest reputation, but he really is a fantastic human being. If you meet him in person, he's a fantastic human being. So I did that for 4 years, producing the Emmys and being the Emmy chair, and then sort of revived our workshops. We had stopped really doing workshops, which is different forums that we hold, like Career Day and different themed events featuring broadcasters from our chapter. So I oversaw that for 2 or 3 years, the workshop committee, and then was nominated by the board to be president during that first pandemic year, 2020.
And that was that before the pandemic, or was the pandemic had was already in full swing, and then you were nominated?
The pandemic was pretty much in full swing.
Okay.
I was nominated in early 2020. It was Steve Novak's last year. Steve Novak's the great WGN director who was my predecessor as president. And he took over for another great guy, a guy named Marcus Riley, who's not in town anymore. He was president for 3 years before Steve was president for 4 years. And then Barbara Williams Perry, another great, person who worked at NBC for a long time, preceded him. But yeah, I started in August of 2020, so that we were right in the middle of the pandemic. And of course, we had to do virtual events. All our events were virtual, including the Emmys, for the first 2 years, and we're back live and in person.
You led the board through, I can say probably just a darker time, less than bright time for most people. We're moving into a different phase of the world right now, into more in-person events. How do you envision your presidency to move about now that we're all kind of coming together in person more?
Well, there were a lot of bad things about the pandemic, but the great thing is that, we learned how to do things virtually. So I don't think that's ever going to go away. We still do a lot of virtual workshops now. And I think that in the future, we're going to be doing things that are hybrids. We'll be doing events where we're in person, but we offer the option of doing things virtually. It's great. It's great in a way to do things on Zoom because you have such a broader reach. For our workshops, we can have people from all over the country. I mean, really all over the world. Whereas we didn't have that. We didn't have that luxury before. So I see the chapter. We're gonna definitely try to get out more. We want to get out of Chicago a little bit more too. and get to because the misnomer is that we're the Chicago chapter, when in reality we're Chicago Midwest. So it's not just Chicago, it's Chicago and Milwaukee and Green Bay and Wausau and Madison and South Bend and Peoria. So all these different markets. And being virtual, have talked forever about getting out and doing events in our other markets, but being virtual allowed us to really get out there and present ourselves and represent the other markets. So virtual is not necessarily a bad thing, but in answer to your question, in the future, I see us continuing to do certain things virtually while we start to become more of a live and in-person organization.
The Emmys award show, it's not the only event we do, but it's the biggest event NATAS hosts. Why do you think recognition is important in the media industry? Why must we hand out awards? Isn't it just, can't we just all get a participation, slap on the back? We all did a good job.
Right. Yeah, that's a great question. A lot of people kind of resent awards shows and giving out awards because it's so subjective in a way. And I know that a lot of people think award shows are self-congratulatory, and I understand that, but it's great because you're being recognized by your peers. I mean, you're looking at this year, I think we have 74 categories, and each category is being it's being judged by a number of different chapters. So it's really the fairest way of being recognized by your peers. Sure, everybody's doing a great job, but this allows us to highlight really great work, and it allows our peers to highlight great work from their colleagues.
I think also a part of the awards is that it's people stay competitive, and I feel like that drives up the standard of work, is that there is something at stake ultimately, and that is to head out. And I guess there's ratings if you're in the TV news land, that's kind of your motivation, but having the awards also feeds into that. And so it's kind of like they exist together in this kind of like recycling sign of relying on each other.
That's a fantastic point, Anthony. That's very true. I mean, this, you're having friendly competition with coworkers and with friends and people that you respect outside of your stations or your news organization. So yeah, you're up in the ante. You're trying to do better work because that there's this carrot at the end of the stick, the chance of receiving this great honor. So yeah, you're absolutely right about that, Anthony.
In terms of reaching out, like you said, to smaller markets, are there any ideas that you have in mind or you're looking into right now of how the organization can do that and stretch its reach beyond just Chicago?
Well, I think we're already doing that. As I mentioned, with all the workshops that we're doing, the head of our workshop committee, Afia Owusu, who's with Weigel Broadcasting, she has these brilliant ideas about reaching out and doing all these different events that aren't necessarily geared towards Chicago. So I think that the fact that we're doing things in a virtual platform online allows us to reach out and do things that don't just involve Chicago. We're also trying to do more with schools and with younger broadcasters. Obviously, the junior board, which was something that was launched during my term, it wasn't my idea. It was the idea of someone who's on the junior board right now, Ros Varen's daughter Sarah, she came up with this idea years ago, and it took a while to come to fruition, but we had a great committee led by a guy named Nick DeGracia, who's still on the board. Obviously, you know him well, Anthony. He sort of set the parameters and the standards for the junior board, and this is something that I'm probably more proud of than anything else that's happened during my term. The fact that we've created this board consisting of, not just broadcasters, students and young broadcasters aged 18 to 26 in Chicago, but also, representing universities and news organizations throughout the throughout the chapter. Another market we have, representatives from Madison and a few from Milwaukee. This is the junior board is one way we branch out and reach out beyond our comfort zone, which is, a certain age of broadcaster based in Chicago. That's one way to do it, through the junior board.
I was curious why, and you mentioned you were out in Boston University, and so you kind of visited the East Coast. What attracted you back to Chicago, or how did you find your way back to Chicago? And ultimately, why did you kind of stick around the area that you grew up in?
1986 and 1987 was the Reagan recession era. So there were no jobs available in 1986 and 1987. So there were financial reasons to move back to Chicago, and I just developed contacts here and just ended up staying here. But it was basically because, and this is true of a lot of students especially students who, I didn't, grew up a working class kid and didn't have a ton of resources. I had to, work my way through school, and, I paid for my college tuition myself and didn't finish until I was in my early 30s. So, financially, it would have been difficult for me to move to another area. I could have done it, definitely. But I was thinking, finances first. So that's why I ended up sticking with Chicago. And I have no regrets. It's a great market to work in. I love the city. There's so much energy, and there's so much history in this city. It's a great American city. So I have no regrets about working here for 30 plus years.
No, yeah, I was going to say, to get into that big market, it's in a little way of a blessing that you had that access. And you've accomplished so much in your career, but I wanted to know, and you have a new book coming out in the next year.
Demo is
right.
the name of the book, Comiskey Park Demo.
So that'll be exciting. But is there anything else that you haven't accomplished, or there's a project that's on your checklist or your bucket list that you really want to try? Or,
well, like I mentioned earlier, I still have a love for fiction, and for not only fiction for television and the movies. That would be nice, but I also have long been interested in writing a book, a fictional book. So I've been playing around with some ideas and doing some writing on that front. So hopefully that'll develop. I'd love to get an agent at some point in the near future to represent, some of the things that I do as an author. So hopefully in the next year or two, I can have more to announce on that front.
So the last couple of questions, we're going to turn to just moving advice on to the next generation. I guess what would be, and this is a two-part if you want to answer it, but what would be your golden rules of writing, and what would be your golden rules of video production, or just producing video in general?
Golden rules for writing is to be clear, be concise, and be honest. And actually, that's sort of the same golden rule for video production, especially with nonfiction. You don't want to meander. You want to be direct when you're telling a story. You don't want to take too long to make a point. So that would be my golden rule for both writing and for video production.
I feel like it's two skills that, though everyone can open up, Premiere Pro as an application, or anyone can write words, I feel like it requires a lot of discipline. Would you agree?
Oh, definitely requires, anything that, if you're doing something well, it always requires discipline and hard work. Creativity is something that comes and goes, but you're never going to get anything done if you don't do the work, if you don't take the time and do the work.
Discipline. I'm glad John ended on that note. With anything, editing, writing, producing, it takes discipline. Discipline to stick with the ups and downs of a career, and any career, you need consistent discipline to be the best in your craft. I think John stands out as one of the original multimedia journalists, and for a few decades now, his work and discipline translates well. You can stick with one medium, whether it's in writing or strictly shooting video or whatnot, or you can have an all-around understanding, but whichever you choose requires discipline to excel. And I think John reflects that consistently. So thank you to John Owens, and thank you for taking a moment and listening to this podcast. If you have any suggestions for who you would like to hear on the podcast, leave a comment and be sure to subscribe. Until next time, this has been The Pursuit, a NATAS Junior Board podcast.